Welcome to Nasdaq TradeTalks. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq. Joining me for this segment, we have Alex Coffey, Senior Market Strategist at Charles Schwab. He joins me to discuss the February reading of the Schwab Trading Activity Index, known as the STAX. It's a proprietary behavior-based index that analyzes retail investor stock positions and trading activity. Alex, it's great to see you as always. Welcome back to Trade Talks. And my assumption is that there was an uptick considering the activity that we saw in the overall market in February.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, we talked the trader sentiment survey last week. So that was traders telling us what they were going to do. The STAX, of course, looking at what they actually did in February in terms of their positioning. And as you mentioned, exposure increased by 6.5% in February to 47.65. This now marks 3 straight months of increases in exposure or increases in that STAX reading, which is really what STAX is telling us. And really, if you looked at it over the kind of the backdated time that we had in this report, of course, it's a relatively new number that just began the last few months, but we did backdate some numbers going back to 2019. Really only sort of that meme stock equity-specific explosion of 2021 saw higher readings. So it's moderate low compared to some of that history, but really we're about as high as we've seen STAX since 2019, with the exception of sort of the really equity-specific investments that we saw in 2021. So really starting to match the intensity of the market. And you'll see by some of the buys and sells that we're going to go through how investors are looking at the market.
Yeah, and it's no surprise to see the buys that are on there. Certainly retail investors and traders are following the momentum in AI.
Yeah, no, exactly right. And this is reflected by the top buys being NVIDIA, SMCI, AMD, amongst others. But the semiconductor chips and the AI trade has been driving the ship since late October, early November, and continues to do that. Even on days like today, where the market's a little bit weaker, you still see names like NVIDIA and AMD on a relative basis outperforming the Nasdaq. And so while they've ran a long ways, and certainly for contrarian traders are probably a tough buy at these levels, for those who got involved, it's been a fun wave to ride, and investors have been kind of following this trend for several months now.
Yeah. And Alex, as we move out of earnings season, of course, you know what happens there, that the market gets hyper focused on what's happening with the macro and the Fed and everything else, that, you know, the wall of worry that the market continues to climb. What are you going to be focused on as we move through March and through the first half of April, now that we're largely out of the fundamental news coming out of earnings?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm looking towards next week's expiration. These quarterly options expirations are always interesting, particularly when you start to see some selling picking up. So I don't know if the last 2 sessions are the beginning of something bigger or not, but knowing that so much of those positions are about to come off the board as we kind of go into that moment, it could be interesting if volatility picks up here a little bit. We do see some exaggerated selling the next few sessions. But, in the interim, the jobs data on Friday, of course, is going to really take over. Federal Reserve and Jerome Powell speaking to Congress is going to make headlines, I'm sure. But the data continues to kind of be perplexing. We've had some readings on the inflation front that are a little bit hotter. We've seen some economic data that's a little bit hotter when we look backwards. But when we look forwards, things like the ISMs, both on prices paid as well as the actual activity, have been a little bit weaker. So it's still that kind of situation where, while the market seems to discount those fears of recession, there's still reason to think that there could be a slowdown. Not saying that there's going to be a recession or that's the kind of the base case, but economic slowdown does seem to be in the cards. We'll just see how the market deals with that.
All right, Alex, appreciate the insight as always. Thanks for joining us on Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.